I'm going to invite Holly and Johan to come and join me up in these chairs at the front here. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to have a panel discussion. Holly is a medical doctor, and Johan is a clinical psychologist. And we're going to start by just having a conversation amongst ourselves around some of the various angles on what it means to be a follower of Jesus Christ in a country in which marijuana is legal for private use. And what does that mean for us as Christians? Does it mean it's okay for us to smoke weed? And if not, why not? Or are there certain ways in which marijuana could be used, which would be acceptable or ethically responsible for us as Christians? And so we're going to have a little bit of a conversation here, and you're going to get to listen in to the panel discussion. And then after that, there's going to be a time for questions that you might like to ask. And I'm guessing your questions will probably be directed at either Johan or Holly, but perhaps also to me as a minister. And let's just see where God leads us in this conversation. So that's what we are about tonight. So I want to start off by saying that the purpose of this conversation is not for us to discuss whether marijuana should or shouldn't have been legalized. I mean, that has already been decided by the courts of our land. Really, we want him to consider what a faithful response is to that. And so that's really what the conversation is about. And as we have this conversation, we acknowledge that there's a range of people here. There are children, there are teens, there are adults of various ages. Some of you are here because this is a personal question that you are asking for yourself. For some of you, it may be family members that you are concerned for, and that's particularly why you're here tonight. Some of you might be wanting guidance as parents or grandparents in terms of how to interact with your children or your grandchildren around this issue. And we just want to acknowledge that there's a whole different range of places that we find ourselves in as we approach this conversation. So I'm going to kick off by asking, and I'm going to kick off with ladies first. And so to ask Holly, just to ask you, Holly, as a medical doctor, what was your response to hearing the news that marijuana has been legalized for personal use, for private use?
I had very mixed feelings about it. On the one side, it may have some medicinal benefits, and it seemed reasonable in that context to legalize it. But I was concerned that I felt it sent a message that this is a harmless drug, and I don't believe for 1 minute that it's a harmless drug. And that it's increased, inevitably legalizing it will almost certainly increase its use. The two currently legal drugs are tobacco and alcohol, and their widespread use. And inevitably, with the increased use, I think we will see the increase in negative effects of the use of the drug.
And can you unpack for us a little bit about what negative effects you anticipate we might begin to see in society as marijuana becomes more widely used?
Well, I think there's a couple of things. I mean, I think the one thing is that there's a perception that it is not addictive, and the evidence clearly points to the fact that it is addictive. That isn't to say that all people who ever use it will become addicted to it, in the same way that alcohol is addictive and tobacco is addictive, but not all people who use them have addiction problems. But it is very definitely a proportion of people who use it will become addicted. And then it's the consequences, both short-term and long-term. So the short-term things are things like this sort of acute memory and concentration problems, the loss of reactions, and that was my other thought when I first heard about it, is how are we going to monitor things like driving under the influence of cannabis? Because in the same way that driving under the influence of alcohol decreases your reaction time and those sort of things, driving under the influence of cannabis is going to do the same thing. And then there are long-term concerns about what it may do to cognitive function, to memory, to motivation, and those sorts of things.
Okay, thanks. Johan, your response to the announcement, as from a point of view of a clinical psychologist. Yeah.
I want to say initially not surprised at all. I think this has been coming for a while. I think worldwide one sees this trend, to relax certain things, and there's been a very strong drive. I agree totally with Holly that it's made out as a harmless drug, which it's not. And I think the big thing is when we talk about cannabis or marijuana or ganja, and I like the Afrikaans term, giggel, twak, that it takes you to a happy place, and it's a recreational thing, which it's not. And we live in a time in the world where there's such a lot of things that we need to cope with. But one of the things is that most of the food that we eat has been engineered, genetically engineered. And if one looks at specifically cannabis, it is such an unknown quantity because those of you who buy the stuff won't know what you buy. I grew up in the 60s, great time, hippies, flower power and peace, and I saw a California t-shirt here this evening as well. That's where it all started. But if one looks at, and Holly, you the expert in terms of the chemicals that's in ganja in those days, the cannabis that we got was 1 to 11 in terms of the relaxing part and the more stimulant part. And today it's 1 in 200. So it's not as innocent. And we don't know where it's going. And it's commercially driven as well. So in terms of the effect, people will say that in some of the statistics, if you look at America, that last year in America, 400,000 people died because of smoking. You mentioned smoking. 100,000 people because of alcohol abuse. And then they will say 0 because of cannabis. But we don't know where this is going. And it makes this argument that it's innocent. So it's got a whole lot of other effects, I think, on the individual in terms of your own moral compass, but also on a society that we live in. I don't know if I've answered your question. Okay.
Can we explore a little bit more? Because I think a lot of people would say, well, the alcohol is dangerous in our society. It is addictive. It has health problems. And yet there are probably only a small fraction of people in this congregation here who would abstain from alcohol. And they would say, well, dacha is comparable to alcohol. Just as only a small proportion of people become addicted to alcohol and it becomes problematic, surely it's the same with dacha, that moderate use would be okay. What would your response be to that argument? You have already responded saying that we just don't know yet what the effects will be, but any other response that you would give to that argument?
I certainly think that part of it is we just don't know. And with the increasing legalization of it around the world, I think there will be considerably more data coming out as to exactly what kind of effects it does. There is already evidence to suggest that it causes structural changes in your brain, and particularly in young people. That your brain is developing right up until your mid-20s. And there is evidence to support the idea that it actually structurally alters parts of your brain, particularly some of the parts of your brain that deal with motivation and various emotions, that it affects those. And so there is the concern that as well as the short-term effects of acute intoxication, that there may be considerable long-term neurocognitive effects of dacha use.
Okay, and for those of us who are not familiar with some of those medical
Cognitive
terms,
is just the way your brain
so
works.
just unpack a little bit what those long-term effects might be.
So things like struggling with motivation to achieve things, but even motivation to kind of go through your normal. I mean, you've got to be motivated from the moment you get up in the morning to go and do things and to go to work and to invest in relationships and to achieve things. And it seems to have some effect on motivation and your sort of brain's capacity to respond to kind of rewards, to investing in things to get things. It seems to impact those. Memory is a significant one. It seems to have a definite effect on short-term memory. There's also some evidence to suggest the fact that it's not just in the immediate hour or two post-smoking it. There's been some concern, again, in young people particularly, that use, say, over the weekend could impact your memory and your learning right through the week, that it could last for several days. And so that could have a significant effect on things like your schooling, that if you can't remember things as well as you should be, or you're not kind of functioning at the level you're capable of, that could carry on for several days after the use of it.
Okay, thanks. And Johan, would you want to add anything to that in terms of alcohol versus marijuana?
I think there's a similarity between the two. We need to appreciate that both of them has side effects. When one looks at the whole thing of smoking, the whole weed specifically, then the question is, why do people do it? And I think younger people do experiment. It's a fact. We all, when we were younger, experimented with dagga and a few. Dagga, all of us? Oh, no. I can't say with specifically alcohol. And I think today, one needs to appreciate that cannabis is amazingly easily accessible. It's not a difficult thing to get to. But why people smoke it is to get high. And why do they? That's the other reason. Why do they want to get high? Why do they want to escape? And I look at young people today, which is the vulnerable group that you refer to, is they're under amazing pressure as well. And in terms of wanting to escape from it, it makes them feel that they relax. And I'm just aware how easily accessible it is. Our son was in Potch for a year. And I remember one evening I phoned him, and he stayed 2 blocks away from the spa. And he walked back, and he said, "Dad, on my way back, on 3 instances, smell people smoking ganja. As a matter of fact, 2 of them were sitting outside on a lawn publicly doing it. So it is a way of relaxing. I've never asked him how he could identify the smell. How did he know this? So it is in a way to escape. But what I've seen in practice and what one needs to appreciate, apart from the medical fact, is that one of the things it relaxes is also your inhibitions. And when it relaxes your inhibitions, it affects your judgment. And when it affects your judgment, that is when it becomes a problem. And in terms of making good decisions and wise decisions, apart from the motivation, you get a perspective of reality that's maybe not always realistic or true.
Okay, so in that sense, it's very similar to alcohol, that you would end up making decisions which you would later regret, exposing yourself to risks which you would otherwise not normally expose yourself to and such like.
I think we also need to appreciate that there is some vulnerable personalities and borderline personalities. And I think what I've seen in practice, and especially in a hospital, when I did my hospital consulting a number of years back, that those people go, because they're vulnerable, because it relaxes your ego boundaries as well. Apart from the judgment, there is a chance that underlying problems, and it can happen that people go over a certain boundary and psychosis will set in. Depression can be elevated as well.
Okay. Johan, if I could just pick up on what you were saying about the pressures that young people are under. So I think there are many of us here who are here as parents or as grandparents, and we're asking, how can we help our children to make wise choices, to guide them in ethical decisions that they take, or in a world in which weed is going to be more and more freely available. So could you just guide us from a psychologist's perspective, parents, grandparents, adults, what advice would you give to us as we seek to help our young people in a world in which they are facing many pressures, but also many choices and many options out there?
This is just a 1 hour conversation or 30-minute conversation. That's a big question.
Yeah.
I think in guidance, I'm very aware, and I think it comes back to us in terms of the example we set, in terms of the values we set, and that hopefully they will take it to heart, to be available to them. But I'm just aware that we live in a time where we're also busy and where parents have their own pressures. And if I look at a lot of young people, it is, in a way, I want to say it's become fashionable for them to, and maybe I just need to take a step back. I think young people often look at parents and at adults and feel that we live double standards, that we're not available. And a lot of young people, in terms of the world we live in, and it's a very unpredictable, it's volatile, it's ambiguous, feel that God has failed them as well, and they're disillusioned in terms of what's going on. And it therefore becomes fashionable, and I've heard it many times where people feel it's fashionable to say they've become atheists as well, because of the shock that they've been exposed to, because of the example that they've seen. And I can cite examples. The other day I saw a senior executive and in my rooms for coaching, and he mentioned the fact that he was home for only 5 of his son's birthdays, and the son was turning 21. So a lot of parents are absent in that way. And the big thing is, young people are seeking. They're seeking for guidance. They're seeking for guidelines. And that's my problem, because it's become fashionable to say that you're an atheist, is that you then openly admit to the fact that maybe you can then make your own decisions and you don't have a moral compass, and the boundaries then get very vague. So in terms of your questions of parents, it's to be there, to be available, to set the example.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay, availability and example, thank you. Okay, I'm sure that there are folk sitting out here. You've come tonight with questions, or maybe as we've been talking, there are questions or comments that have come to you. So if you can just raise your hand. I think Nico is there with, or one of the ushers is there with a microphone. Laura, thanks Laura. So she'll just bring the mic to you, and then you can ask whatever question you have. Okay, right at the back there. Thanks, Laura. Okay. Okay, is that on there?
I was just wondering, as a Christian, my spirit, how does this whole weed situation actually affect me? How does that affect my spirituality about going on with my day-to-day life? How does it, because I haven't been to church often, but I feel like I can sort of say I'm a Christian. But now with this coming in, I've experimented, I've done weed, I've been there, but I've never thought about it now, especially now that it's legal, it's making me think, how does that actually affect me? Is it just a matter of about your body, or does it not affect you as a Christian?
Yeah. Okay, that's a good question. So, I mean, part of what we've said so far would be helpful for or interesting for anybody, whatever faith, if you're a person of any faith or no faith. How do we approach this from a Christian point of view? And I guess that's where I need to come in particularly. Hey? Yeah, so I think that there's a couple of scriptures that I'm actually going to ask Jackie to just put up on the board, which begins to answer that. And it's very interesting that the first three scriptures that came to me as I was thinking through what Scripture has to say about this, they all came from 1 Corinthians. It seems that the Corinthian Christians were Christians who were testing the boundaries of what is acceptable as far as Christians and kind of pushing the limits. And this is what Paul had to write in 1 Corinthians 6, verse 15. He said, just because something, and I'm reading from the Message paraphrase, it says, just because something is technically legal, doesn't mean it's spiritually appropriate. If I went around doing whatever I thought I could get by with, I'd be a slave to my whims. Okay. And so Paul was talking here about sexual immorality. And if we can think of an example here of, for example, adultery. It's legal, it's not illegal to commit adultery, but we know that as a Christian, it is wrong. It damages our relationships, it damages our families, it damages our souls when we sin sexually. And so from a spiritual point of view, that would be my concern about weed use, is that does it damage our souls? Further on, 1 Corinthians 10, verse 23 to 24. Here, Paul is talking not so much about sexual immorality, but he's talking about a debate that was happening amongst the Corinthian Christians about whether it was okay to eat meat that had been bought in the marketplace, which may have been sacrificed to idols before it was sold. And there was certain Christians who felt it was okay, certain Christians who felt that was really a problem. And Paul writes in verse 23, he says, I have the right to do anything you say. In other words, those are people who are saying there's no problem with it. And then he goes on to say, but not everything is beneficial. I have the right to do anything, but not everything is constructive. No one should seek their own good, but the good of others. And then skipping right back to 1 Corinthians 6 again, he says, don't you know that your bodies are the temples of the Holy Spirit, who is in you, whom you have received from God? You are not your own, you are bought at a price, and therefore honor God with your bodies. So for me as a Christian, if I look at Corinthians in particular, Paul seems to be saying to us, look, your bodies are wonderful gifts that God has given to you. And the Holy Spirit lives inside of you if you're a follower of Jesus. And part of your responsibility, with privilege comes responsibility. So if you've been given the privilege of this wonderful body, then look after it. Take care of it. Don't use substances that are going to alter your brain and affect your ability to remember things or your ability to be motivated. And so for me, it's part of our spiritual response to God's saving work in Jesus Christ, that we honor God with our bodies. I think the other thing, sorry, I'm really preaching a sermon here now, but the other thing is that I'm reminded that one of the fruits of the Spirit is self-control. And when we use substances which affect our self-control, are we not working against God's Spirit at work in us? So whether it be alcohol, and the Bible is very clear that it says, do not get drunk on wine, which leads to debauchery. It says, instead, be filled with the Spirit. That's from Ephesians 5. So we shouldn't be, as Christians, we shouldn't be taking into our body substances which are affecting our ability to exercise self-control, because we are called to make wise decisions. And, marriages are ruined by people who are under the influence of alcohol or drugs, are unfaithful because their impulse control is affected. People contract terminal sexual diseases by decisions that they take when they are under influences of substances which affect their self-control. So for me, it's about saying that part of our spiritual practices, part of our spiritual discipline is just to exercise self-control. So you couldn't come to church and not get a sermon, hey? But those were some of the passages that came to mind as I was thinking about what scriptures might guide us as we consider this conversation. Okay. Right, let's go to Andrew. Okay, and then.
Hi, good evening. More of a comment than a question. I can't help feeling that the use of marijuana, it's a multi-billion rand business. And I cannot help feeling that part of the rationale of legalizing this now is economic. The government's now going to get tax out of this. So it's controlling it. So that's just a comment as well, first up. A couple of years ago, I would have been dead against the use of marijuana, absolutely, until someone very, very close to us has experienced the medicinal benefits of it in controlling pain. So that has totally shifted my feeling towards the use of marijuana, and certainly, yeah, it's going to be a difficult one. I think this is going to be one that where I think still a lot of questions need to be answered, as far as how it's going to be distributed, how the tax is going to be collected, and so on. Is it going to be VAT-free? Good point. Anyway, just a comment as far as that is concerned. Thank you.
Okay, so yeah, that's a great question about what about medicinal use of marijuana.
Circumstances, the two main conditions in which there is kind of scientific evidence that it does make a difference are chronic pain. It does seem to can make a significant difference in chronic pain, and in the nausea and vomiting that are associated with chemotherapy. And so cancer patients are patients where it's been particularly positively used in, because they're often experiencing both pain and side effects of the chemotherapy. And I think that is a different kind of situation. You know, all of the drugs that medical science uses have risk-benefit ratios. All medicinal drugs have side effects, but we weigh those against the potential benefits and argue in particular cases that although this has risks, it has more benefits. And I think there may well be a case to be made in things like chronic pain and cancer management to say this drug does have risks, but it may be that in these situations, its potential benefits outweigh the risks. I think that's quite different to recreational use, where really the potential benefits are, I would argue, zero. But I mean, I guess the high, people would argue, was the potential benefits. But there, I think you've got a situation where your risks outweigh your benefits, whereas that's a different situation in things like cancer. There are a lot of other circumstances in which it has been tried. There's anecdotal stories about it improving epilepsy, Parkinson's, multiple sclerosis, spastic cerebral palsy. There will be lots of people who tell you they have tried those in those circumstances and it has improved their symptoms, and it may well have done. But in terms of actual kind of scientific data and randomized, sort of controlled things, the two big ones are chronic pain and chemotherapy.
Yeah, Andrew, I think you're absolutely right that it's a multi-million rand business. And yeah, that drives it, the economics behind it. Just to complicate the thing further, there's very little research about this, as you mentioned, but in Holland, where it's been legalized for a long time, they have sort of set the pace in terms of this. And there, what you get for medicinal uses are better regulated and more consistent. The big danger here is that because it's economically driven, you know, you don't know what you get, and people want more out of it. Some of the people that's been, and this is the older people who's been recreational smokers, and I think that's the difference between smoking weed and using it in different forms as well, will say they can't get the mild stuff anymore because people are pushing it, and that's where it's really enhancing the risks.
Yeah, I think there was a question over there. Oh, you covered. Okay, right.
Just ICU, and we've already given for quite a while cannabis oil for children with epilepsy, but it put you on edge as ethically, really, because you don't know that babies what the outcomes are.
And I don't think we do know the outcomes. I mean, one could argue that that may be the one good thing that comes out of it being more widely available, is we may have better data on its medicinal use, because it certainly has been used in things like epilepsy, and there are people who will tell stories of it having really quite dramatic effects, but we don't know. We don't know enough about it.
Okay, sorry, Johan? Yeah?
How does this thing work? Is it on?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it is.
Hi, Father. Okay, I'm getting orders to sit upright from my mom.
You mustn't put him under too much pressure there, hey?
Yeah, I've actually got like a few comments from what I've heard now. I had to help my dad with his research. Yeah, it was quite fun.
It was not practical.
Something that needs to be mentioned is that cannabis is being talked about as one thing, but what needs to be mentioned is that there are different strains. For example, sativa and indica. Sativa, a bit more of a hemp type thing, not used for recreational use as much in terms of the psychedelic effects, but more of the calming effects. Indica is the one that is being bred for psychedelic effects and less of an effect on calming down. And then there's also the use of male plants versus female plants, because basically the more psychedelic effects are gotten from female, yep, and it's actually sexually frustrated female plants, because how they get them to be more psychedelic is they take away the male plant, and then the female plant just keeps producing flowers, the buds that are then used. So it's to remember that you've got the super strong stuff and the super light stuff, and then to compare it to alcohol is you could be just drinking a beer or you could be downing a bottle of vodka. You just need to find the middle ground and just be aware of that. And when it's legalized, you can start controlling this, because we know what a drink is, we know how much tobacco can be smoked, but we do not know what a unit of measurement is for marijuana. So that is something that can only be found out if it's legalized.
Okay. Right, just behind you there.
My name is Herman, and I was born in Brakpan, so I can give a different point of view. Our fences are loose there. When the police came to us, we just moved your fence so that the cannabis is on the other side. So that's a safe way to do it. What I want to say is very simple and easy. I'm glad that the law is taken away, that it's now opened up. And the emphasis on the wrong side of it, if I can put it that way, was way too heavy. We will catch somebody with cannabis in his pocket and we will jail him. Somebody can be the head of the government and he can steal billions, and we will never get him in jail. So the negative side of the things that we overemphasize, that what's a bad side, and we focused on this one culprit in life. I want to use another example, and we do nothing about it, and that's food. Food can be the deadliest poison, or it can be the healthiest medicine that you use in your life. And I asked the lady that's educating the dietitians at the university, why don't we educate the children at school? Why do you educate people to teach us about food when we obese and when we overweight, when we're sick? Only after that. And she said, well, she don't know. Our food can be poison, and we do nothing about it. But somebody else, and I don't think there's many people that smoke cannabis here. Yes, I'm going to plant my seed. I've been keeping it for a long while. But there's not many people here that use it, I think. And we're fighting about it. I just want to say again from Brakpan, I'm glad that law has been removed. And we must live a balanced life and a responsible life just as we do it with food. Anything goes with food. And the people are getting sick. And they die of it, and that's okay. But when somebody smokes weed, we up in arms. We must love him like Jesus would have loved him. Jesus loved all the weird people. And if he was here tonight and there was a cannabis guy, he would have loved him. Coming from Brakpan. Thank you.
Thanks, Herman. I think Herman raises a very interesting point, and that is that this conversation is not about judging other people. This conversation is about us deciding, making our own decisions for our own lives, taking responsibility for our own lives. And as that song we sang, every time we point fingers at somebody, we got 3 fingers pointing back at us. So it's about our own ethical decisions, and we're not here to decide for other people. Okay, I think let's have 2 more questions. Let's go over there and then over here to the right. Yeah.
Hear that the use of marijuana can have a negative effect on your professional performance, right? So I wanted to ask, can a person be imprisoned if you are caught in a drug screening for using marijuana?
Can you be imprisoned if you are in a drug screening and found to have marijuana in your blood? Your blood, is that right?
Say at your work.
I would not be in a position to answer that. We don't have a lawyer expert here, but I imagine you could be dismissed from your place of employment in terms of labor law. I'm pretty sure of that.
I would imagine that it's going to follow. I mean, all those details are going to have to be worked out now that it's legal. But I would guess there's going to be a similar approach to that of alcohol. So no, it's not illegal. No, you're not going to be arrested. But if I pitch up at work drunk, I can be dismissed on the spot, and that's it's an instantly dismissible offence. And I would imagine if you arrive high, it may be slightly more difficult in terms of. I mean, we're going to have to look at how one measures these things, because at the moment you are able to actually have drug alcohol level measurements, and that determines that you're not allowed to drive, you're not allowed to be at work, and those kind of things. But I imagine that marijuana will go a similar way, that there will be some form of screening and you would be dismissed but not arrested, I would think.
I think there's a 2-year time frame for Parliament to come up with the legislation, which will flesh out all of these details. Okay, let's go to Gerard here.
How's it? I think what people must also remember is it doesn't stop just with the marijuana, because they will actually start using Mandrax, and then it will move on to ecstasy and stuff like that. So, yeah, that's a problem.
So, yeah, so perhaps we just want to have some comments from you, Johan. I'm not sure whether you'd want to comment on this, Holly, in terms of the whole idea of marijuana being a gateway drug, and I know that there are different views on this one. Yeah.
Oh, exactly. You used the term, it is a gateway drug. And people that get on to the more serious stuff will actually tell you that this is where it started with marijuana. So it's part of that judgment, and you want more and more as you go along. It's just interesting to me now that question about the legal aspect of it. When we were in Australia last time, we were standing at the station, and there was a little dog there and 2 cops, and this one guy came in. The dog sniffed everybody, but then the dog sat down and this one guy, and they took him around the corner, and we could see, and they manhandled this guy. They body searched him. So in Australia, I want to say to you, watch out. And the big thing, he had nothing on him. And they warned him. They said, you must have been close to somebody who had weed. So watch out in terms of your friends. And that's not what we have over here. But you're quite right in the big thing. You can be fired. It can have consequences.
Okay, thanks. Matt, okay. Shall we make this the last one? Yeah?
So it's more of an efficacy question. So, for instance, my brother was a cocaine and opiate addict. Could it be the fact that marijuana is the lesser of the evils?
Some people will actually say that people that's been on heavier drugs, that marijuana will be a good substitute to get them off it. So it can be used in that way, has been used in that way.
Okay, friends, there's lots more that we could talk about. I'm sure we could be here till late into the evening, but I'm sure that Johan or Holly or myself would be available if any of you would like to just come up and have one-on-one conversations after we have closed things off. But I hope that this has been helpful for you, just to get you thinking around your own decisions, around what it means to be loving and supportive of the people in your family circle and in your friendship circle, and also to have an informed opinion in terms of how your faith influences issues that are going on in our society, and I imagine it will be helpful when you have conversations with people out there. So we're going to close our time together by singing, and I'm going to call on Mike and Matt to come forward now. And just want to say a huge thank you to Johan and Holly for being available and for doing research with assistance, and for being here to help us think through this. We're very, very grateful for that. Okay.